next session follows the theme of today's conference, which is growing. This panel will debate how the industry can help grow the financial wellbeing of New Zealanders from differing perspectives, including campaigns and activities targeted and their effectiveness. It is my pleasure to introduce the following speakers to the stage: Nick Astwick, CEO, Southern Cross Health Society; Melissa Cantell, CEO of Fidelity Life; Karna Luke, Executive, Customer Products and Services at BNZ; Fiona MacKenzie, Managing Director, ANZ Funds Management; and our facilitator and host of the Nutters Club on Newstalk ZB, Hamish Williams.
Hi, I'm Hamish Williams, and late on a Sunday night, I spend a couple of hours talking about mental health issues. And over those years, I can tell you, there's a couple of things which I've realised they have in common with money. Number one, no one really likes to talk about it. Number two, we only want to talk about it when we're in crisis. But the third thing, and this is the good news, the third thing, and we all know this in this room, is that when we do talk about our finances and we do talk about our mental health, we feel a lot better. So, how do we have those conversations and be able to get people to be able to embrace financial literacy and confidence? Well, obviously that's the theme of the conference here and why we're here. Do we walk out on the street, grab people, shake them violently and tell them that this is important and they should pay attention? I'm reliably informed that's otherwise known as common assault and not a good way forward. So instead, I've got some very well-measured experts with us. We are going to be joined by Karna. The poor man has been trapped by a traffic accident this morning, so he has been frantically texting us and emailing us for the last half an hour. So when he gets here, we'll just bring him on. Anyway, thank you so much for being here with us today. You should all have microphones that you can just pick up. Now, we will be taking your questions as well at the end, so use the app, text them through, and we'll get to those near the end. Guys, I think it's really important if we're going to talk about wellbeing, financial wellbeing specifically, that we all kind of define what that is, because I think it becomes so often that we use buzz phrases like this, and then if we don't actually have any context, it's like, what the hell are we talking about? So, Melissa, I'll start with you. What is financial wellbeing to you?
Sure. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Now, I actually Googled this because I don't like to get things wrong, and I thought, let me work out what this is actually defined as. And then when I looked at most of the definitions, I realised that my personal view was a little bit different, which was quite interesting. So when you Google financial wellbeing, you get a lot of answers around confidence, and you also get a lot of answers around actual financial security, so you are able to meet your financial needs. For me, it's a little bit different. That's more financial health from my perspective. I think wellbeing is slightly different. So having the confidence to be able to make the right choices and to have certainty, perhaps in those times when your financial health isn't as strong. So we all know everyone every day can't always meet their financial needs. That's the reality of life. Your well-being, similar to your mental well-being, is around how do you approach that? What's your resilience? Can you set yourself up to, even in the toughest times, make good decisions and have certainty about how you might find your way through that?
Yeah, good thoughts there. Nick, what about you?
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Hamish. I think the first thing is the distinction between, as you say, mental health and mental wellbeing are not the same thing. So if you think of mental health at one end of the continuum is sort of the absence of a mental illness, and on the other side is a diagnosis, a clinical diagnosis of mental illness. But then you put mental well-being, at its best is flourishing and at its worst is languishing. Yeah? And I think when you look at, the state of New Zealand at the moment, not everyone is flourishing at the moment. In fact, 2/3 of New Zealanders are not flourishing, and a large portion of that is because of their financial well-being. Yeah? And I think that's the ultimate challenge. Now, when you look at well-being and its definition, it's largely a combination of physical, emotional, and a relationship or social connection. And I think specifically to financial well-being, I think a lot of the focus is on the state of people's finances. But actually, I think when you look at the psychology behind financial well-being, it's actually their relationship to their finances. Yeah? And at the moment, I would say there is an unhealthy attachment to a large amount of Kiwis to their finances. And then that's sort of hidden. If my finances are bad, I'm bad, or they're failing, I'm failing. And I think that has to be overcome, I think, to be able to progress.
Yeah, it's the classic, I've gone on the holiday to Fiji now because I can, but could I actually afford it? People feeling that pressure.
That's right.
Fiona, what about yourself?
Look, great comments from both of my colleagues up here. I'd probably just build on that a little bit and talk about the longer term. I think there's a lot of emphasis when people are talking about financial well-being, talking at the very short term. The reality is in the financial well-being space, behavioural and good habits, even at the lower income end, just little habits, which is why KiwiSaver is such a great intervention. Those feeling empowered to make good decisions for yourself that build up and compound over the long term, that's a really large part of financial well-being. I think that's where, when I think about, and I'm ageing myself here now, by the way, I grew up at a period in New Zealand where we were very much, the mantra was girls can do anything. And so girls from my era of high school were sort of pummeled with the idea that we could go out there and take on the world. Interestingly, when I look back at that now, the concept of financial well-being, and in particular women being financially empowered and investing for themselves, that was very much missed from that mantra. And I think that's something we're playing catch up on now. And so back to financial well-being and what it means to me, a lot of it is about behavioural habits that are going to compound and add up over time, and leave people feeling much more empowered and in control of their financial destiny. So it's less about, have I got enough money? It's, am I able to do the things that are positive and are contributing to my financial well-being and empowerment and freedom over the long term?
Okay, I think we've got a good lay of the land there now, guys. So obviously we're calling the conference Growing Confidence in Financial Wellbeing. So when we are looking at what that actually is, I think often we think that it's some far-off thing or it's something that we're not doing. And I think everybody in this room knows that you will have already made some massive efforts over the years. And so I'd really like to start, rather than talking about what we need to do, just a little bit of retrospective and look back over the past, let's say 10 years. In the last 10 years, what have been some of the biggest changes that you have seen to financial services? I'll come back to you, Mel.
Sure. So I might answer that adjacent to financial services, but maybe a bit more broadly from a societal point of view. So I think one of the biggest things for me that's happened over the last 10 years is that we're actually having this conversation. And I reflect back to when I first joined this industry about 10 years ago. This wasn't a topic that would have been perhaps the banner for a conference.
Oh, you made it.
Oh, hello.
Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Karna Luke. He's only been trying to get here for the last hour. Oh, you got a mic. Fantastic. Welcome, mate. Sorry, Mel.
That's okay. So that's been a really big shift. And I think, similarly, you draw that parallel to physical health and physical well-being. And that's a conversation that started quite a long time ago, the difference between the two and how one feeds the other. And I think over the last 10 years, we've started to explore that more and more from a financial point of view as well. So it's not just around the financial health, it's the well-being, the mindset, the resilience that sits underneath that. So that's a big shift, and without that happening, we're never going to go the next step. I think the other thing that I've seen happen is around accountability for financial well-being and the changes that have happened over the last 10 years. So it wasn't that long ago when the conversation would have been, and very similar to what you're saying, the man in the house does the finances. My father was a banker. I say that carefully, it's a B, he was a banker. And look, I grew up in a home where every Sunday he would pull out the checkbook and he would reconcile everything that Mum had spent over the past week, and there would be red circles and pens and receipts, and there'd be a big conversation around why things didn't balance, and I witnessed that on a weekly basis. And when my father passed away, my mother was left unsure of how to manage her own financial circumstances, and I've watched her learn and grow, into her 70s as to how to do that. And so there's been a huge shift, I think, in the last 10 years around who is accountable for financial wellbeing. It's a much broader conversation now. There's been some great work done, certainly by the FSC recently, around financial wellbeing for women, education for children. So that broadening is happening, which is great.
Yeah, I like that idea of the conversation actually being one that we're having out loud, and even just recounting those kind of stories about your own experiences. That's really important. It's important for us to know why we're where we are right now. What about you, Nick? Because you've background in banking as well as what you're doing currently with Southern Cross Health Insurance. What's some of the big changes you've seen over the past decade?
Well, I'd agree with Melissa. I think the biggest change I've probably seen is, the start of any change is a recognition of a problem. So I think that awareness has really started to build. There's still a massive stigmatisation to it, but I think it's starting to, as I say, be normalised a little bit more. I would also say in the last 10 years there's been a lot more investment, I think, in the education of financial literacy schools, the bankers of this world. And so I do think some of the tool sets going in are really helping, sort of making that more of a normal conversation.
Yeah, so making that education less exclusive, actually being able to broaden it out in a bit better way. Fantastic. Fiona?
I think it's been an incredibly exciting last 10 years, and I think New Zealand has actually played a massive catch-up. So when I think back to early 2000s, and I've commented on this a couple of times in different contexts, but New Zealand for a long time was pretty much the only country in the world who every year in October would pop up and say, oh, it's so many years since the 87 crash. We had a real withdrawal from hands-on investing post the October 87 crash, understandably. But I think the last 10 years has been quite an extraordinary chapter in our financial journey. We've had the New Zealand Superannuation Fund has demonstrated in a great way the power of compounding and being really smart and opportunistic and built up an amazing track record. KiwiSaver, I think, has been a game changer in terms of giving pretty much millions of New Zealanders the opportunity to learn by doing, and again, seeing how little adds up and makes big, in a relatively short period of time. I signed my kids up for KiwiSaver when they were 4 years old. Every year they get their annual statement, and the discussion I'm having with them now is, look, there's your investment returns. Let's bar this year, obviously. It's been a tough year. But prior to that, we were able to say, look, this is how much you've made this year, and by the way, how hard did you work to earn that? And the answer is not at all. So really great learning by doing with KiwiSaver. And then I think the third thing that's massively changed the game in New Zealand in the last 10 years is the Fintech platforms. Historically, you'd get out of JFK Airport in New York and jump in a cab, and the cabbie driver would say, what do you do? I'm an investment banker. They'd say, right, what stocks do you like? That was the conversation most times. Never used to get that in New Zealand, and it feels like in the last 10 years a light's finally flicked, and we've actually got the idea that, if you can't invest in growth assets like housing at different ages and stages, actually an alternative is to invest in shares. So I think there's a lot that has changed in New Zealand in the last 10 years. And if we'd been having this conversation 10 years ago, I don't think any of us would have predicted how much that change would be. So I think all of those three things add up to a huge change, which gives me a lot of confidence we're on a good track.
Yeah, my 15-year-old sometimes asks me, and he has asked me to ask the question to you guys today, who should he be putting his money in for sharesies? So, 15 years old, I was more worried about, where we were going to watch the Super Rugby on the Friday night. I didn't even know about the stock market. So I think that's a huge thing. Our young people are getting engaged with this content and they are learning. Anyway, let me know your tips later. Karna, welcome.
Thank you.
You made it.
I did. My apologies.
No, that's all right, mate. Lovely to see you. So, look, in the last 10 years, what has been some of the biggest changes that you have seen? What have been some of the big achievements in the financial sector?
I think a lot's been covered already in terms of the panel. I would agree with the fact that we're normalising the way we think about, financial literacy, and we're doing that through things like KiwiSaver. The change in terms of understanding when probably we grew up and mum and dad were like, get your house, and that's going to see you right. To today, where people are talking about different investment classes and how can I make money, and it's not just about making money; it's about how can I create wealth, and whether it be a business or whether it be an entrepreneurial idea or whether it be investment, it's the use of money for prosperity. And I think we've got a long way to go, but I think those conversations are changing a lot more regularly with our young people, and the questions are being asked and answered. So financial advice is something that I think is becoming more prevalent, and it's a normalisation of what we need to have. Is like looking after your health and well-being, look after your financial well-being. And if you can do that at the same time, then you'll get prosperity. It won't come overnight, but like everything, if you keep working at it, I think that's been one of the changes that has been normalised over the last 10 years.
Even things like MYOB and Xero, being able to get your invoice from the plumber and you can literally just hit a button and pay it straight away. I mean, that in itself has been a revolution which we didn't have 10 years ago. Okay, so that's the past. What does the future look like? Karna, look, we didn't get you at the start, so I'll come back to you. What are the things that you're prioritising at BNZ to be able to see the growth that we're all here to talk about over the next decade?
Yeah, well, for us it's about how do you help communities prosper and how do you help customers actually deliver what they want to deliver, whether it be service, whether it be product, whatever it is they're trying to achieve. It's about being in lockstep with that. And we talked about it before, so the fintech, so making it easy, so the transactional nature of money flow, making that easy, making sure that there are innovative products that people can use if you don't have, the capital behind you in terms of what you need to do, and then just facilitating that growth so people can transact. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next 10 years. Well, I kind of come back to the question around what's the role of the bank? And if the role of the bank is to help communities prosper, then how are we situated to help everyone in the community? Because there are a lot of people who understand financial literacy, but there are a lot that do not. And those that do not, how do you get access to information in their hands so they can make good choices? And they can, so we talk about vulnerable communities. We talk about communities, and your question, your comment before around mum and dad, and mum didn't really have that understanding of financial wellbeing, and then have to learn on the trot. We have a lot of marginalised, communities, and one of those communities at points in time with the male-female is female, in terms of understanding how to work through that process. And just recently, certainly at BNZ, we're looking at the amount of females who become widowed, the amount of females who become divorced, and how they are not actually capable, not in a capable sense, they're very capable, but when it comes to capability around understanding, well, how do I manage my finance? And because they just haven't been given that opportunity. And so how do you support that? And we want to be there to support, women in different situations. We want to support vulnerable communities. We want to support, communities to prosperity, and making sure we actually drive that as a message, and drive that because it's available for everyone. And it comes down to a basic need for people, and it should be available for people.
Oh, look, absolutely. And in the multiple stories where I've talked with people around their mental health, it's always been I call it the C word. Sometimes you get some funny looks for one. But the two C's is community and connection. Yeah. And without those, that's where that mental well-being strays into mental illness. Which I wanted to just pick up on what Karna was saying with you, Nick, because he's talking about prosperous communities around education, which is what you were sort of putting your definition of well-being, financial well-being. So what is Southern Cross looking to deliver over the next decade when it comes to being able to see that grow and achieve it?
Well, just probably wider than Southern Cross, because I think the first thing is we've got to recognise that there's still a problem. I think that's the first thing. And I think we did a Healthy Futures report not so long ago that basically said that the three of the top four worries in New Zealanders, the first was the cost of living, the second was the impacts that COVID could have on the economy, and the third was access to housing. So they round out the three things out of four that give New Zealanders their well-being the greatest risk and challenge. So even 50% of Southern Cross, our people at Southern Cross, they say their number one issue affecting their health and well-being is their status and comfort with their finances. And so I think the first thing is we've still got a problem that we need to lean into. And I think we all believe in the prosperity of the country, but that prosperity will only sort of, realise itself by an individual, a family and a community being prosperous to start with. And I think that I think we've got to do more focus on the healthy attachment to your finances. So there's a lot of work going
redefining what does being wealthy look like.
Well, that's right. I think success for me would look like that you can, like I guess the progression of mental health, is you can have that conversation with a family member or a friend first. I mean, your advisor is there is to help you with solutions as well, but at the end of the day, it's got to be something that's normalised, and that's something that is, while I'm having problems with my finance, I'm not the problem. And I think you've got to detach those two things, and that does take quite a bit of work to understand and to, I guess, progress.
Mel, where do we be able to sort of help people like your mum's situation? I mean, having to suddenly learn about finances in the 70s, what are things that we can do to make sure that she's learning about it when she's 17 rather than 70?
For me, success over the next 10 years would look like really going to the grassroots of this challenge and weaving financial literacy and financial well-being into the education pathway for our children, and not just some of our children. So I think the points that we've been talking about up here are right, in that we are, hearing from young people these days. They've got apps, they're on Sharesies, they're having conversations that certainly I wasn't having when I was 15. But those are not all of our children. So we know we have some really fundamental challenges with education in New Zealand at the moment. Some of the numbers are quite horrifying around what is happening to literacy and numeracy levels, school attendance, and every child who's not learning basic maths is going to struggle with learning financial literacy. So I feel like we need to really tackle this at the heart of the issue and make sure that we don't perhaps broaden the divide that's already growing in our country between the haves and the have-nots by making sure that all children are educated right at the beginning, and this is a conversation that's being had, whether it is in your traditional education environments like schools, or whether it's on the marae or in different elements of the community, that we're really helping everyone learn the basics from the start.
So following on from that, Fiona, where can we as financial services industry actually be able to apply what's necessary to see that grow over the next decade?
Well, I think, just first of all, I think Melissa's spot on around weaving it right through the curriculum at schools. Banker, who many of you may be familiar with, has done an extraordinary job, I think, at sort of matching together all the basic concepts around investing and saving and being financially focused into a beautiful digital experience. So they've effectively gamified it, and it's really quite amazing stuff. But I suppose the reason I think Melissa's spot on with that comment about education, if you think about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, te reo was not part of the common curriculum, certainly when I was at primary school, which is longer than 30 years ago. But that language now is completely thriving and is really beautifully interwoven with everything we do as New Zealanders. That happened because te reo was made a core part of the educational curriculum in New Zealand, and I think financial literacy is exactly at that level. And I think Bank has proven you can do it in a scalable, cost-efficient way that appeals to Kiwis from all walks of life. So that's absolutely where I'd start. But back to where I'd focus in the next 10 years, I think financial services providers like ANZ really are leaning in hard around how do we provide more of our customers with reassurance and support when it comes to investing. We think back to March 2020, it was really worrying to see the number of customers who saw volatility in the markets, and their first instinct was to switch funds from a growthy fund into a very conservative fund. And unfortunately for those customers, that turned out to be a really poor investment decision. They made a short-term decision in a long-term product. And so that's something we're putting a lot of effort into. How do we provide reassurance and support for our customers? And it's a little bit, and it sounds a bit twee, but it's basically the keep calm and carry on. KiwiSaver is such a long-term investment that you've got to try and keep putting your long-term lens on it. Pleasingly, with the volatility we've seen this year, we have not seen customers hitting the switch button, which is awesome. So I think New Zealanders are really maturing rapidly when it comes to thinking about financial wellbeing, and they've learned the mistakes from earlier in COVID. But sort of stepping back even further across all of ANZ, we are thinking really hard about how do we have joined up conversations, how are our customers experiencing increasing cost of living right now, from the KiwiSaver team through to the home lending team, through to the frontline team. For example, our team is seeing an increase in the number of customers inquiring about hardship withdrawals from KiwiSaver. We're not seeing the withdrawals yet, but we have seen a bit of a tick up in terms of inquiries, which is something that's a bit concerning, so we're keeping an eye on that. We've joined that up with some conversations we've had with our home lending team as well to see if there are other ways those customers can be helped rather than tapping into KiwiSaver. So to answer your question, I think it's having these joined up conversations, thinking about customers and their financial wellbeing quite holistically. We also use our financial wellbeing indicator or index as a way to try and cherry pick and understand where there are issues starting to emerge. So that surveys on a rolling basis about 7,000 people. So we're starting to see definitely, the bad news is we're definitely seeing people get a bit more concerned, not surprisingly. The good news, I think, is though that we're seeing the good habits that built up during COVID continue. So people are paying down their home loans faster in some cases, which is great, and they're sticking with their savings habits. So actually, I think in terms of how we're positioned for the next 2 to 3 years, which could be bumpy, things are actually not looking too bad. But for the 10 years, it's all about providing reassurance and support, which I think long-term gets to Melissa's observation about her mother. You know, how do we help people feel confident that they're making good decisions with the products they've got?
And isn't that interesting, just to pick up on your point about the KiwiSaver in 2020, was that conversation was had, and it was had really publicly, because if you'll remember, it was reported on quite widely. So what I've seen happen with the way that mental wellbeing's been talked about is it's actually been about consistency. It's not talking about it when something untoward happens. It's about consistently having these conversations if you actually want to see meaningful change. And I would say that that's going to be the same when it comes to financial wellbeing, is about how do we weave it into everything so that it's not always a salacious bad news headline. Make it consistent. As much as I love talking about the future, I also like to talk about today. When it comes to, when we talk about again, and seeing investment into ideas, you say, the next 5-10 year plan is this, that, and the other. And of course, we all looked at it with great optimism. But the reality is that we've got people who are struggling due to not having financial well-being or financial confidence today. You're a reasonably smart bunch of people. So I wondered, have we got, and I'm going to start with you, Karna, the takeaway. What do you think is something that New Zealanders could do today, differently to what they're doing, that would make a meaningful change in their financial well-being and confidence?
That's a really good question, Hamish. I think part of the starting post today, you have those components, but the starting block has to be about the holistic nature of your needs. And understanding that the financial literacy component that you need, it could be as small as saving $1 today. And that's okay. So the starting conversation has to be about how do I continue to meet my needs now and into the future? And you can use that through, and we were talking about it, Melissa, before, a wee while ago, we were talking about the difference between how many people understand what insurance delivers and how many people are underinsured in this country, whether it be home and contents, personal, redundancy insurance, those sorts of things. People just don't understand that connection to it and what that means in terms of their livelihood, because circumstances change. And I think given what we've been through in the last 2 years, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity and ambiguity that exists in our current environment, you need information now more than ever to start today. So whether it's saving for your first home, whether it is saving for a holiday, whether it is actually putting money into KiwiSaver for your children, whether it's sitting down and having the conversation with your children, whether it's sitting down with your 75-year-old mother and help, which is what I do, and help her budget what she's going to do in her retirement, those conversations have to start today. And I don't think we're having enough of those conversations today. And I think, my one wish and takeout is we normalise the barbecue conversation that talks about finance. We all go to those barbecue conversations and summer's coming up. Well, my challenge to everyone in this room is to normalise the conversation about financial literacy and well-being. So your financial health is as important as your own personal health. And that's really, I think it starts there, because then the demand on organisations and companies like banks, like insurance companies, like Southern Cross becomes a two-way conversation. But today it's a one-way conversation. It's what I'm coming to you, how do I get my needs met in terms of this situation? And actually the demand on us should be, how do you help me grow and prosper? And that's the hope I have.
I'll give you a hot tip, Karna. It's not about finance, but it's about how you have those conversations.
Great.
One thing I've found big time, and it's been for people that I've had as guests on the show, and even through sharing my own stories, is that when you have that conversation, so if you actually started to say, this is what I'm doing with my finances, you're actually putting a flag up, and what ends up happening is you give other people permission in their own minds that they can then talk to you. So rather maybe than being sort of confrontational, because some people do take it that way, you ask them, tell them what you're doing.
Yep.
Tell them about your KiwiSaver. Start with it really basic, because when you volunteer through that information, it is like an open welcome for people to join that conversation, but you guys can be the leaders out there. So awesome. Great one. Mel, what are we going to do today?
So I'll take Karna's view and I'll build on it. So I think absolutely the best thing we can do right now is to start the discussion. This is a room of however many hundred people we've got who are all incredibly financially literate, I assume. And you all work with people who are the same. And if each of you took one opportunity in the next week to start one conversation with someone around financial well-being, imagine the difference that might start to make. So we can't sort of wait for the world to change around us. How do we start that momentum ourselves? The second part to build on that would be, what conversations could we all be having to help bring more people into our industry? So the conversation's not going to continue and the well-being isn't going to grow if we don't have a strong financial services industry, and particularly financial advice industry, to support New Zealanders. I'm not sure if we're seen as the sexiest industry out there for people to come and join, but my view would be we are the most meaningful industry that exists. So how can we change the narrative, attract people into what we do, increase the conversation more and more, bring in younger demographics to the industry so they can start conversations with younger people as well. The ability to change that lives with us to sell the amazing story of what we get to do every day.
I would say don't tell people, show them. Let's just get out there and do it.
Nice.
Fiona?
Oh, you skipped.
Oh, I thought I'd just skip. I was keeping it random, keep them guessing.
Oh, okay, we can just mix it up. The thing I would do, I totally agree with the talking about it. I think Sir John Kirwan is a phenomenal example of how do you demystify a difficult topic by just talking about it. So I completely agree with all of that. The thing I would add, and it is something all of us in this room could literally be doing now, is just keep putting our customers at the centre of everything we do, because the reality is we are not actually the majority of New Zealanders. We're a pretty privileged bunch, and I think being really crystal clear about who our customers are and understanding them in a really deep and authentic way, both qualitatively and quantitatively with all the data we have, I think that's actually going to help us continue and very quickly deliver better support to our customers. So that would be my big, quick, short-term plea for CX.
No, I like it. Put people at the centre of what we're doing. It's what it's all about. Well done. Nick?
Well, as I age, I think I sort of more deeply believe in the power of the business institution, not just the sort of government institutions for getting change. And I think there's two things I would comment is people that. It's not just one demography that has an unhealthy relationship with their finances. It's across people with good salaries and lower salaries. It's something that everyone, I think, at points in times does suffer. So I think businesses and leadership within business has a huge role to play on two fronts. The first is, if culture in an organisation is what the leaders care about, do we genuinely care about our humans' confidence and trust with their financials? It's walking into our employment, our businesses every single day, and so it's affecting their productivity, it's affecting them as employees. And secondly, are we intentional? Are we taking that first step to say, okay, we're going to ask the question, we're going to understand that impact in our organisation, and we're going to do something about it?
Thanks. Now it's over to the questions, but this one is not a question, It's a comment. It's pretty good. Everyone in their packs, so when all of you arrived, you should have either got a backpack or one of the things, or if you're like me, you took one of each. And it says, everyone in their pack received a set of money conversation cards created by the FFC. It starts with Action Working Group. Use them. There you go. So you've all got cards in your little pack there. I think that does deserve a round of applause. Okay, here's a question. How do we get the financial services industry to collaborate, working together, leveraging resources and funding to make impactful change in respect of New Zealand's financial well-being, rather than everyone doing their own thing, which with much driven by personal agenda and profile?
Can I start on that one? I think that's a
go
great
for
question.
It.
I would actually say and I'll give Richard a shout out here, I think the Financial Services Council has done quite an extraordinary job getting a bunch of very, very competitive firms together and cooperating. So some of the stuff the FSC, to be honest, sometimes I sit there and go, gosh, they're really getting into the weeds here, but they have genuinely taken financial services firms are brutally competitive. That's just ingrained, brutally is not the right word. They're very competitive. It's ingrained in their DNA. But what I think the FSC has really nicely done is step back and said, let's think about this with a New Zealand lens on it. Let's think about how we empower. And I think Melissa's right. This is a great sector in terms of empowering and uplifting and funding the future growth of New Zealand. So I actually think we've got the answer. It's the FSC. And I would just encourage more organisations to be members and weigh in and participate and be part of that.
Karna, what do you want to weigh in on that one? Because you're talking a lot about communities, and I'm wondering, where do we start with our own community to leverage that?
Yeah, you can't be what you can't see. And so the points that have been made here, things like, I know what we've done is we've set targets in terms of making sure that we are bringing in Māori communities, Pacific communities that are on staff. Because if you normalise it that way, then if you can see what you can be, then you can go be it. But making those communities understand and help them with building capability and financial literacy and providing that commentary, it starts to showcase that you can do this, you can achieve, you can be better, and that's really important. No disrespect, but we'll take a look at around this room and we'll think about the diversity that we create here. So how do we make that available and accessible for everyone? And again, that's setting a really, set target, making sure we're clear, making sure that those communities get that information in a way that they want to receive it, whether it be on a marae, whether it be at a festival, whether it be at those times. You can celebrate that, but you can also, have prosperity and well-being at that same time.
So it's not necessarily about the message, it's about the messenger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which speaks to your point, Mel, and how do we attract those people into the industry? Because, look, I can tell you, I had a guest on the show one time. He was a hardened crim. He'd been making and selling meth for 22 years, and then he changed his ways. But he was going back into prisons to speak with other hardened crims to tell them that a law-abiding, peaceful life was possible. Now, if any of us in this room had gone in to deliver that message, it probably wouldn't have gone down so well. But because it was him, it was real, they could relate to him, that they were able to actually start believing in that. So how do we get people into this industry to be able to go and be those messengers?
I think we're missing a trick on how we market ourselves. So the reason I joined financial services and the reason I stayed are really different. So I joined because I'm interested in transformation, and I could see, really challenging sort of intellectual and very interesting industry to participate in. But what I realised when I joined was that the meaningfulness and the purpose of what we do is extraordinary compared to any other industry I've ever worked in. And there is a richness in that story that people connect to when you talk to them about it, when you really focus on the help that we give to people every day, whether it's through an insurance conversation or a wealth conversation, the security and the confidence that we can create, the claims conversation that you hear, which makes you realise how much help you're providing. What an incredible industry to be part of. But those aren't the stories we tell, or perhaps that we don't tell enough. And the industry is seen as a profit-focused, money-hungry, all of the traditional conversations are still there underpinning the views of what we do. And I think if we can tap into that different story, particularly now as we have younger generations coming through who we know are far more focused on a purpose-led career, the difference that they can make, we've got the best story out there. So again, a huge room full of advocates. So how do we go out there and start telling it differently?
Nick, is there anything you want to add on this?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think the core of financial services was really for social outcome, ultimately at its core. That's its genesis. And so I think just reframing that the outcome of a financial service is empowerment. It is building wealth. It is protecting risk at its core. Yeah? And I think just keep on remembering that the genesis and the purpose of those organisations are those outcomes.
Have I got time to take more questions? Yes, no, maybe? I didn't hear anything, I'll just keep going. This one, you've spoken a lot about education, but knowing doesn't always equal doing. Think eating healthy. What more can industry do to encourage or nudge customers towards taking tangible actions that improve their financial well-being?
I'll kick off because I think that's a great question, and it leads me to a place around data and security of privacy. Because in the future, in the not too distant future, i.e. right now, the war on data and your available information is being won by a lot of different platforms. And so having information at your fingertips, your information, your personal information, and what you do with it is very powerful. We haven't yet seen the complete end of where that turns up. It turns up today on your phone in terms of your phone listening to you and it's shooting you, articulation of where you should buy next or what you should do next. When you reverse it, you go back to putting the customer at the centre. How do I want to use that information? And how is the data that is being collected on all of us, how is that going to be used? And what is your role in choosing to use that information? So there is a really important point around people understanding how powerful their information is, and it's theirs. And there's another really important point to say, you get to choose what companies do with that information. Companies don't get to choose to do to you, whether it be financial institutions or platforms or otherwise. And so we've got a job to do around that literacy, finance and data and security. And protection. Like the fraud scams that are going on really right now are very intelligent, and we are still seeing people being impacted by that. Financial loss, significant amounts of financial loss, and that's a big problem. It's a massive problem for us. So heading into the future, we've got to be able to drive into that and have people understand what they're going to do with their data and what privacy means and how they own that information.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we used to laugh it off that, it was a Nigerian prince sending you an email, but they have been, the scammers have been practicing this. Well, we've been continuing on for the last decade, and they've got incredibly sophisticated. Are you seeing some of this, Fiona, as well, and when you're working with your bank?
Yeah, no, within ANZ, absolutely we are. And so just from an internal level, so we have a team at ANZ that is constantly making up and sending out phishing emails, and they're getting more and more sophisticated. And then I get a little scorecard for my team, how many of my team clicked on these emails, and I mistakenly clicked on one the other day. So they're pretty sophisticated. But what that's teaching us internally is how sophisticated these efforts are getting. And yes, absolutely, externally, our personal team there is a lot happening in that space, and it is literally becoming a bit of an arms race. So the more we can do to empower people at the phone end, totally agree, and then the institutions have to be all over this. Cyber is massive.
Mel, anything you want to add?
I would just say, how do we translate education from telling to doing, is just to be super practical. I mean, I think back to my childhood, and I'm showing my age now, and many of you who were primary school children in Auckland would have had a little yellow plastic elephant, and every month someone from ASB came to my school and I had my little passbook and I brought in my 20 cents and it got banked and they filled it in, and I started saving from when I was 5 years old. And that was so practical and so tangible to me. And has stuck with me my whole life. And so what is the 2022 version of that tangible conversation, whether it's for children or others, to just help make the story really practical. There's nothing quite like I love your story about KiwiSaver with your kids, around seeing your money grow to make you realise what you're able to do without sort of too much effort.
Well, we've got to leave it there, but I want to have a big round of applause for all of our panellists today. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you, Hamish, Nick, Melissa, Fiona and Karna. I'm glad that you were able to make it in the end. It's great to see senior leaders in our industry with such a genuine passion for New Zealanders' financial wellbeing and really living into those FSC values and our strategic vision to grow the financial confidence and wellbeing of Kiwis.